Thank you, Andre, and it's really wonderful to be here. This is my third time here on campus. It's really fantastic to return. About 7 years ago, I came the first time, which was when Cherie Smith invited me to give a lecture, and I was able to meet Michael Ray Charles and have a long conversation with him over drinks one night, and it's nice to be able to contribute to this project with an essay and then with this conversation. And I wanted to start out by talking about returning. You know, this is a return for you, a place where you spent many years teaching and working. And when academics leave universities, sometimes they leave behind intellectual legacies, but you've left behind now a physical object, right? And so I wanted to kind of start out with, what is it like to come back? What is it like to engage the space with an object, and with this piece in particular?
It's interesting. I don't feel like I've left.
Yeah.
And you're walking through the space and seeing not only that particular piece, but other images around that I produced over the years, and seeing familiar faces is quite rewarding and refreshing at the same time.
Yeah, I saw in the Gordon White building there are a number of pieces up of yours.
I've tried to get him to take some of them down, but it feels good. It feels good.
So coming back to the campus, coming back to Austin, never having left, I mean, you have a strong, long attachment to the state of Texas.
Well, you know, I've cut my professional teeth here. I mean, I came here right out of grad school, so everything I've learned about academia has happened here. Mm-hmm. So, and I should say that whatever institution that I'm affiliated with, you know, now and thereafter, you know, is measured by, you know, what I've learned here. Mm-hmm. And I've learned a lot.
Like what?
Oh. Where do we start? No. I would say, you know, I met a gentleman years ago when I first came here, who didn't think very much of me at the time, and we ended up on a panel in Beaumont, and afterwards we became really good friends, and still today, whether he would like to think of me as a mentee or not, he's my mentor, mm-hmm. Dr. Gordon. Mm-hmm. And I think the leadership is important. And I learned that this place has lots of it and has really strong leadership and wonderful leadership in major positions. For example, Andre and what she's doing, and Nisa, and when she's not there, I mean, they are an amazing team, and they get things done. I hope I didn't, where are you, Nisa? I hope I didn't provide you with too much stress over this process. But yeah, I'd say leadership for starters, and there are others, you know, but I'd start with leadership.
Yeah, and leadership, you know, is something that grows over time, right? Learning to lead. The work itself, placed in this space of the kind of newly expanded and remade Gordon White building, it takes up a very interesting position in this transitional space. And I understand that you work not only on the sculpture, but on the entire space in which it resides, helping to choose finishes, make decisions about how the exposed brick would be retained. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what the process was for you in thinking about the environment, the kind of site specificity in which the piece would live.
That's a really good question. You know, in my own studio practice, you know, I reference a lot of things, and to make a painting. And in this particular case, it was not that far of a stretch. I think the major differences was the timeline, because Bart and his crew had a timeline, a very specific timeline. So in addition to Andre's timeline, Landmark's timeline, and I had a lot to consider in relationship to what the space should look and feel like early on. So lucky for me, I have this thing for like clean lines and walls, so just painted a slight off-white, shell white, and that wouldn't conflict with the sculpture. But then there were decisions about lighting that I'm not sure how much it set us back or pushed us ahead, but nevertheless, a lot of decisions had to be made up front. Then there were other issues regarding the process that had an impact upon the work. Obviously, the space, the width of the space, the height of the space. I mentioned earlier, ideally, if I could conceive this piece again, I would love to see it probably twice as high in terms of height, and something that would be on the ground. I like the ability to see through it, for starters. So there was a number of things that factored in. The preservation of that previous exterior wall, accessibility from the upper level, all of those things factor into how and what that piece turned out to be.
Yeah. So we were talking about the different perspectives on the work, if it could be up a little bit higher. When you walk in on the first floor, or maybe technically it's the second floor, I think, right? You see the piece from above, and then going up to the third floor, you're able to engage it kind of on a one-to-one level, almost that you can reach out and touch it. But you envision it maybe higher? Huh?
Yeah, I mean, when we were installing, that was one of the interesting things about it. Obviously, climbing these scaffoldings that was set up, but contemplating how this should be engaged visually from beneath, directly underneath when you first entered, and from the opposite end of the atrium, and also from up above. So all of those things factored in, and I felt that so much of the process was structured in terms of planning out how things were supposed to be in terms of the parts and the tools, that I needed the time to play, and I don't want a limited play in terms of make it seem carefree, because it wasn't so carefree. It was more strategic in terms of, hey, I want a crutch here and I want it at this angle and so forth.
And the building of the piece, was it done, I mean, it's all suspended aerially, but were you able to build it aerially like that, or was it on the ground or on a platform? How did you put it together?
Well, we assembled several of the wheels or stars, as I often refer to them, and lifted them into place, and I didn't anticipate the amount of how much it would weigh. So once we got one of them into place, we used scaffolding and really just started attaching several and constructing it in relationship to the wall, the space in the atrium up above, to try to give it a presence. I was really interested in movement. Really interested in movement, actually, because the space is very narrow, and I felt like I couldn't put anything that were restricting it, and there was so much of a relationship between that exterior brick wall, previous brick wall, and this new wall. I felt like whatever needed to enter that space or be placed in that space had to relate. It couldn't be so heavy and dense that you couldn't see through it, one. And it had to relate to, well, really the space defines the function of the piece, in a sense.
well, there's a real lightness to it. You
Yeah.
know, you talk about the heaviness of the actual material, right?
Yeah.
But the suspension of it gives it a kind of lightness. And going to see it today, I felt a kind of meteorological aspect of it, like it was a weather formation itself, kind of twisting and writhing, and almost like an inverted funnel cloud coming up from the bottom and moving out towards the window and out towards the street. And the mechanism by which it's suspended sort of disappears into the space, so that it's almost there kind of under its own volition. You know, and the colors of the Crutches, the kind of taupey ochre colors, rhyme with those, they kind of mimic those of the brick behind them. It all, you know, it all ties together in a very elegant way.
You know, it does. But when I chose to use the Crutches, you know, first of all, I contacted several places and was able to find one company that had a certain amount of Crutches available. I purchased them and asked where could I get more. They said we couldn't supply anymore.
Because these are the old-timey wooden Crutches you're using.
Yeah, well,
Were there differences in, like, you know, versus aluminum Crutches, or?
Yes, these are laminate, so but they're wooden Crutches, and it was important for me to use the wooden Crutches over the aluminum Crutches. I thought aesthetically, the wooden Crutches in that space between the brick and a half wall would be a bit more visually pleasing instead of the starkness of the aluminum against the brick wall. Plus, there were thoughts of transition. The old building to the new space in the new building, that atrium became really important in terms of ideas about movement, not only movement, but I think a transition, I think of sound as well. So I thought that there was a different transition with wood in terms of its feel than aluminum. And once we were able to get enough of the Crutches, then things got really interesting. But I would say it was pretty telling to me. I really believe that at some point I was thinking about, well, maybe this is a marker of a time that once was, because you can't find a laminate Crutches or wooden Crutches anymore. More durable, lightweight aluminum is replacing it. And I think the guy at one of the places said, well, you could find them at Alibaba, but you have to buy 5,000 boxes. You have to purchase 5,000 boxes at a time.
Well, you didn't need 5,000 of them then, huh?
No, I didn't need 5,000.
No. But there are a lot of them there, right?
They are.
I mean, to get all of those stars, how many did you end up using in the end?
26.
So there are 26 stars with how many Crutches in each?
Eight Crutches to construct each of the
So
stars.
I was not a math major.
Neither was I, but
So, but it's a lot, right? We'll call it a lot.
Yeah.
When I was asked to write about the piece, and I was told, oh, he's putting together this sculpture and it's made out of Crutches. I said, sculpture? I said, I know Michael Ray's work mostly from paintings and from prints. And when I started working on your work in the mid-90s, it was that work that was familiar to me. And in thinking about this project, I came to appreciate your interest in material objects. And so I was curious if you could talk about your work with material culture objects, with antiques, with collectibles, and your interest in working with things as well as with images.
Well, in my own work, I always felt like it was important, I still do feel like it's important to make art that's useful in some capacity. And not just something that people are able to hang on a wall or use as a piece of furniture. And almost studying advertising and design and then continuing to pursue information in various ways. You know, I discovered Raymond Loewy's design work and streamlining and Henry Dreyfuss's work with his 2D work with trying to develop or explore ways to find or discover a universal language through symbolism. And also his work with ergonomic studies of the body and the measurements of the body, sitting, standing, average sizes, so forth and so on, which influences a lot of design, whether it's a chair, whatever. I became really interested in industrial design and still am, and of course materials in relationship to that. It's not a far stretch for me to make this sculpture. It doesn't look like anything that I've done previously, but I think I was able to employ similar strategies in terms of making. So my assessment of the material in terms of what it could do and couldn't do, and how much did I want to alter it, and I didn't want to alter it that much. So I think it's well in line with the work that I've produced thus far. But as I've matured as an artist, I think, you know, if the right material is appropriate for what, you know, you want to use, it's just a matter of understanding the possibilities and limitations of those tools and then how you choose to apply them.
So in addition to those design influences, what are other influences for you artistically?
I would say great thinkers.
Yeah.
I'd say great thinkers is not just, you know, painters, and there's a lot of art that intrigued me and moved me. Music, excellence. I think people that are excellent at what they do, and you know it, and you feel it, and you see it, and it's nothing that they're trying to do, they just do it, and that intrigues me.
In terms of excellence, you talked a little bit at the beginning about leadership and excellence, and the work itself connects up with the history of this university, right, and the history of academic programs and centers that have served underrepresented minority populations and histories and cultures. I was hoping we could talk a little bit about how you see the work connecting to that history, to that kind of struggle for the recognition, for the ability of communities like the African American Studies Department, the Mexican American Studies program, to realize their goals, the potential for those programs, for classes, for student involvement, for a kind of a central place on the campus, and how that ties into the work.
Well, that's a lot. I would just say that choosing the crutches as a tool to use in a work of art, I anticipated that there might be some issues with it being perceived as a negative, or negativity being associated with it. But I wanted to take something that I can repurpose and apply it in a way that offered the possibility for new interpretations, hence a star or a wheel. You know, wheel is a suggestion of mobility. Even if you don't draw the circle around the arrangement of the stars, I mean, the star, how it's used as within society, our culture, perceptions in the world, is something that's special. I think that assembling them in that fashion is to anybody who walks in, if they could get to that point where they can make that leap away from it just being just a crutch, to making that leap towards it being recontextualized, and then have the potential to be read in different ways, in ways that could be uplifting and inspirational. That's something that I was after.
You talk a little bit about, about risk taking, right? About the idea that the crutch could be taken in a negative way, right? And a lot of your work takes tremendous risk, right? Tremendous risk. Putting yourself out there as an artist, that's one of the things that, as an art historian, art historians cannot do anything without artists.
I'm glad you said that.
Right? There's very little function, right? Very little function for an art historian without artists, without art history, but without continued art making. And one of the things that
Can I quote you on that?
You may. One of the things that I am constantly in awe of, as, I don't want to say a failed artist myself, but I did my first 2 years in art school and quickly realized that it was not a path that was destined to make me successful after talking about it than doing it. Right? Mm-hmm. But artists who go out and make work like you have been making for the last 20, 30 years take tremendous risk. In having to face the criticism, the responses that audiences have. And this is a work that takes risks, but how do you kind of see yourself? How do you continue to do that? What are the resources you draw on?
Well, I think of language, and I try my best to pay attention to the language of the times that we live in. Mm-hmm. And I think of how I could best understand the languages that are at play, and how I could reference, solicit, utilize that, language to inform the work. And I do intend to make things that communicate in my absence, where I don't have to explain it, anybody else standing there has to explain it. So I try to think about human behavior, our value systems, what we consume and why we consume, how we consume, to construct work. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's kind of like second nature. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine not approaching it that way. So I am interested in people leaving with something. I am interested in people interacting with the work and questioning it, most importantly. Whether, they leave with what I intend, that's something I can only hope for. I doubt that happens often, but when it does, that's a good thing. And you talked about some ideas when you walked through, and I was smiling because those are similar ideas that I thought of. Mm-hmm. So, it's a conscious effort to make something that, in a time where I believe we spend less time looking critically. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in making something that stands in people's way a little bit. Mm-hmm. And maybe they have to go around it, maybe not physically, but in their minds they could go around it. Mm-hmm. And
in a lot of your work, there's a lot of humor. Mm-hmm. Humor seems to play a role as a way to both allow viewers to engage painful things, but also to kind of mitigate some of that pain.
Yeah, I could not imagine making the work that I did, much of the work that I did through early 90s, and if I couldn't laugh mm-hmm. at it. And through laughter, I was able to really approach it in a different way. Approach it in a way that it's about the ideas and not about people. Oftentimes, it's just like when someone takes a photograph and says, "Well, that's me. That's me." It's just not. This is not an image of me. This is me. This is me. I'm not painting people. I've never painted people. I painted ideas that people share and exchange, and sometimes they're not the most accurate in terms of representation. But it's not for me. It's for the viewer to step in and engage the work and figure out where he or she, what he or she feels about it, and where he or she feel in relationship to what the work is saying to them.
So, let's see, it's almost 10 after. Do we want to go to questions? Yes? I'm sure there are lots of questions. So if we have the lights up maybe a little bit so that we can see people. Oh, you're there. Okay. So do we have questions for Michael Ray Charles? Andre, yeah.
Michael, having worked with you on this project, I know how much care and attention you gave to the physical structure and space that surrounded your sculpture. And I just thought that it might be interesting for you to talk a little bit about what those considerations were and why that particular location was interesting to you in choosing to put your work there.
Well, Doug Dempster used to say, "More bang for your buck," all the time, and that's something that's stuck with me. And that was probably the largest space I felt like I could make something that could resonate. It almost as if it becomes a part of the building, you know. But as I thought about what I was going to make and how it was going to exist in that space, I could not avoid pondering the presence of that wall from the initial building, the old geography building. And that particular presence now being, it suggested to me that if you're not going to cover that wall up in the schematic drawings or the architectural drawings, that it suggests importance. So I felt that I wanted to keep the wall as it was. I didn't want it cleaned. If it was a nail hanging off of it, I wanted that nail hanging off of it. You know, for years I'd say I'd wrestle with my work, scraping and scratching and pulling away paint and layering. I think there's beauty in the presence of the past. And that wall was, in a sense, a part of, you know, it's like the process that I would go through in my own work. It was there. I didn't have to do anything to it. You know, plus there's so many ways I think you could look at I think about why preserve that exterior wall in this interior space. And if I'm not mistaken, it's one of the earliest buildings of the institution when African Americans couldn't get in to this institution. And I think it added greatly to concepts of tension between the brick wall and the open space in the loft area. So those were a number of ideas that came into play when working with that space or in that space.
Sharice?
The sculpture was built at the end of the spring semester. The semester was closing, and it kind of disrupted the flow of the building for about 5 or 6 days, but in a really positive way because we all got to see the sculpture
What was the process of building, taking over that space?
Well, I hope it wasn't that disruptive. Yeah. I enjoyed it. It was physical, lifting the crutches, moving the scaffolds. I had a really wonderful crew. I don't see them here, but
Did you have an audience while you were working? Did students
occasionally,
stop?
Yeah. And Dr. Garden would come
Yeah.
by and nod, smile. Where is he? Come on, brother. Come on, man. It was like, no, it was good. It was long hours. It was tiring, but it felt great. I couldn't wait to come back the next day and start, climbing those ladders again and doing more work.
Yeah.
I really
I
enjoyed
think
it.
process and witnessing process is really an important aspect. I think so often when we engage art, it's almost like it landed from outer space, in the middle of the night with a laser beam came in, and it just sort of appears, right? And so seeing something being built, something being installed, and knowing that it's a process of making, right, and a process of collaboration, and that there's an artist, right, who has a concept, but the making it reality is, in this case, a group effort, right? It involves a lot of hands. It's interesting. There.
First of all, thank you so much for the work and for being here to share your comments. I think for those of us that are incredibly familiar with your practice, I think there's been such an incredible amount of interest in this work because on some level, considering your previous work, it seems like a kind of departure. And so my question is, does it feel to you like a departure from the previous work?
Yes and no. I mean, just feels like I'm stretching a little bit. I think it's fairly consistent with the other work, but the emphasis is not on sarcasm, it's not on parody, it's not on comedy. All those things are kind of stripped out. I would say that this is more. I felt like I was doodling, like sketching, and in a different way.
As an administrator, I'm often in the position of trying to gather resources to invest in the public art program. And in defending that, one of the arguments that resonates, I think, with most faculty and administrators is that it is an important part of the educational process of our students. And maybe and very important for the education of not art students so much as engineers and scientists and communicators and all that. Your piece has now joined that group of public art pieces that we have. And could you speak specifically to your piece and maybe even more generally to the public art program as to what you think the importance of it is as we educate students on the campus, all students on the campus?
Well, I mentioned before, I would say this. I started out as a student who wanted to play basketball. And when I realized there wasn't going to be any NBA, my plan B was a last-ditch effort to make sure that creativity was a part of my life. And my plan B worked. And it's provided me with time and insight that I doubt that I would have gathered had I done advertising, which was plan A, or plan C, which was pursue law. And in my own practice as an artist, I learned that I'm not bound to a discipline of looking and thinking. All disciplines are available for me as an artist. And I like to think that what art provides for everyone, if we spend enough time and if we learn critical thinking and critical thinking skills, there's math, there's science, there's literature. All of the disciplines converge on art. And it's just a matter of how we celebrate it. And, you know, and thank you, Andre. I mean, we talked about this earlier. I thought she was doing too much of this. And she said that she had to do it. And it reminds me of something else I told to another friend. And it's important. It's important. Every time a student looks at art, that they know that they can look at it, and it's okay not to have an art history class to look at it, or a lesson to look at it, or have to take an art class to look at it. But I do wish that there was more opportunities for the presence of art to be truly understood across the spectrum within the institutions. And I think Andrea is doing good work to do that. I think UT is doing great work to do that.
Yeah, the importance of public art on campuses and kind of continued contemporary contributions to that, I don't think can be overstated. You know, sometimes when you go onto a campus and you see, you know, these 19th century sculptures that are so easy to walk past, right, and to not see and to not stop and read the inscription and figure out who it is or what it was placed there for, but to constantly have new works joining their ranks, and then as students to have the opportunity, students, staff, faculty, to have the opportunity to engage with a work that is not about, oh my gosh, I have to write a paper on this, or oh my gosh, I have to respond to it in a formal way, but to be able to have that contemplative moment and to think about the way that the object resonates with one's own experiences. You know, it's an important thing.
You know, in my opinion, Texas, UT is kind of the cultural source for much of culture and arts that comes out of art that exists in Austin. And a huge part of it is landmarks, and is quite visible.
Uh-huh.
It's a beautiful piece.
Thanks.
I can't wait to see it. Even from the images, you've taken a crutch, which is some kind of symbol of disability and weakness, and you literally and metaphorically elevate it.
Mm-hmm.
And so now it's something beautiful and powerful and soaring. But what I'm trying to figure out how you did that. It wasn't just by moving a crutch up in the air and hanging it. There's a huge amount of repetition in it.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, and this is sort of a typical question, right? That how much of that did you have to put in, and when did you know it was too much or too little? How much repetition do you need to turn a mundane object into something so powerful? But there's something transformative about the sheer scale and repetition of that object.
Well, the easy answer would be I just sort of knew when to stop. But I think for me it was about proportions, and you know, I looked at that space and from beneath, divided it into thirds. I knew that I thought about the glass wall and light coming in, seeing outside, transitioning into another space. I thought about the half wall and how people would engage the work, looking down upon it, looking out at it and through it. I started thinking about proportions and movement. Towards the end, almost in the beginning, I thought, wow, I just make something that just sort of feels like it just blew in. But that piece didn't happen until the end. And it was just a matter of, again, the Crutches, I didn't want to disrupt the form of the Crutches. I didn't want to break them up. I didn't want to reattach and whatnot. I just wanted to be able to overlap and create negation by layering and extending. And again, I wanted a lot of movement. So, and plus Andre said we had only so many boxes we could use. No, I said I'd mess with her about that one, but it was more so about movement. I felt like certain areas needed to be denser, certain areas needed to be more linear. So it was about movement.
Well, the denseness of the kind of the left side of it, if we're up on the balcony, I'll say from the left side, with all of that kind of the tangling of the Crutches and the way they intersect and move into each other and are kind of bolted together and connect, and then the resolution at the end where it's just one crutch kind of pulling out from that that kind of that whirlwind of Crutches. So there's the kind of the crutch on its own that gets connected back into that whole with the WHOLE, right? The complexity of those connections is extraordinary, you know, and you say that you didn't take them apart, right? But the fitting together, you know, seems incredibly complex.
You know, I wanted angles, I wanted movement, I wanted contradictions, I wanted contrast. So what you'll see is, you'll see a lot of, and progression. So I could have attached them like this, but if I attached them like this, there was a sense of progression and movement in certain directions that did this, and at times, but they were never side by side, or at least I tried not to put them side by side. I always wanted to create diagonals from one edge to the other.
Staggering of them.
Yeah. So if you look at the corners or the points, they'll do this, and so that it's always this kind of movement.
Yeah, there's a real kind of organic aspect to it.
Well, I think that a lot of that came from this space. Having I wanted to go close to that wall, and at times the Crutches go right up to it. I think there might be a few that really kind of you know, sits on the wall. But when he pushes towards the back of the space, that half wall, it sort of stops in terms of movement. I imagine this thing as if it's moving. So the wheels as if they're doing this, and they're at different angles. And I feel like when it gets to that, the northeast end, I feel like it stops, does something like this in terms of its movement. I'm not explaining that correctly, but
you know, I mean, as a sculptor, and one of the things, you know, when one is teaching art history, one says, you know, really good sculpture, you know, needs to be looked at from all different angles and needs to be relevant from all different angles, you know, as opposed to, I mean, some things are made to just present from the front, if we think about, you know, Egyptian funerary art, for example. But this one, you know, you really do have to see it from all angles, which is something that I encourage all of you to do. If you haven't been in the space, go there. I hope that you enjoy it at the reception tonight, which we will be going to momentarily. So I'd like to thank you so much, Michael Ray, for your time, and everyone else for coming.